now let's welcome the first speaker. So we have started with psychology. I know you did a master in psychology, so this is a topic that you also like.
It was another life. I trained as a psychologist and specialised in adolescent psychology. Now that I've got two little boys under 2, psychology is a daily experience, I guess, for many of us too. But I think it's great that we're starting with the complexity of the human brain and the way that emotion interacts with learning and the way that art stimulates us to learn as well. It's a complicated, like lots of things in psychology, and an unknown field. But I think when we're trying to understand audience, psychology and the best in psychological thinking is a great place to start.
So we have 2 keynote speakers to start with. The first one is scientists, neuroscientists, and the second one is journalists. So it's interesting to have these 2 points of views, and both of them are really talking about emotion and creativity and how it works in our brain. So you will be inspired by these 2 keynote speeches this morning, and then we will continue with case study later in the day. So let's start with the first one. David Sander and the chair, Pascal Houschmidt. And I'm very grateful of Pascal. I ask you to come on stage with us, and we can applaud them because they're coming from Switzerland. I'm very happy that Pascal was being at Communicate in the museum for many years now. Make this suggestion of starting with David. I mean, Pascal, you've been at the, first of all, you're an expert in photo. You do many touring exhibitions all over the world. You love to partner with all the organizations, so now you're here to share with us during these 4 days. You are doing amazing work on fundraising, on also leadership programs in your teams. So you do many things at the Musée de l'Élysée. You've been there since 2009, and you work with David a long time ago, and that's why you had this suggestion to invite David to open the conference today. So we leave you with David to open the conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Corinne. Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Communicating the Museum. I'm very honored to introduce you to David Sander, who is surely one of the most visionary and inspiring professionals with whom I have had the pleasure to collaborate. And to tell you a bit more about him, I thought I would ask you a few questions. How are you feeling today? How did you feel when you entered this auditorium? How did you feel when you saw the Mona Lisa this morning, if you went on the tour? How did you feel when you ate a croissant that reminded you of your childhood holidays in France? All these emotions we all feel are really at the heart of David's very impressive career. Where do they come from? What triggers them? What impact they have on our brain, on our body, on our community? How can we use them? Very important research on these questions led him from a PhD in cognitive sciences to his current position of full professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Geneva, where, amongst many other things, he's the director of the CISA, Centre Interfacultaire en Sciences Affectives, which is really a pioneering research center. It's a worldwide reference in the field of emotions. I'm always very impressed when I go there because there are, psychologists, neuropsychologists, art historians, linguists, economists, who all team up to carry out groundbreaking research on emotions under David's leadership. And it just so happens that all of this expertise and all of this knowledge is just next to the museum where I work. So I've never hesitated to contact him when we were working on exhibitions that were addressing highly emotional subjects. And more recently, for example, we teamed up on Philip Halsman, a beautiful retrospective which we organized. And you might know Philip Halsman, you'll know his images, a great photographer of the 20th century, one of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century. And he had this idea in the 50s that he would ask people to jump and take a portrait of them as they were jumping, because he thought that, well, if he did that, people would not be able to hide who they really are. And he could capture in a photograph their true essence, their true nature. So, sounds very good, but I was curious to know if it really works. So I called up David and said to him, listen, we're working on this exhibition. Could you send over a dozen researchers to think about this together? Perhaps they could share their expertise, their field of research with our visitors on the basis of the exhibition. Perhaps we could do some guided tours and publish a little book. And David said what he always said, yeah, sure. And that's exactly what you said again when I called you and invited you to come over to Paris to talk with us about the emotional brain, to talk about emotions, what impact they have on memory, on attention, and how this is instrumental in the process of learning and the process of education. So thank you very much for your precious time, and a very warm welcome to Communicating the Museum.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pascal. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and talk about emotions and learning. Given that I will not talk later in my talk about museums as such, I thought that I would start with a slide on museums and highlight the collaborations that Pascal just mentioned, which really was for us a starting point of our interest working with museums. And we did a few collaborations with museums, always working on the topic of emotions. And maybe the largest exhibition that we did was with the Museum of Natural History in Neuchâtel, where we did a full exhibition on emotions. But this is not exactly what I want to talk to you about today. Today, what I would like to discuss is really what are emotions? You know, how can we define emotions? What is a function of emotions? How can we investigate emotions in the brain? And what are the effects of emotion on attention and memory? This is just a slide to start with the notion of a definition of emotion. And if you ask yourself, what is an emotion? Try to wonder how you would define it if I was to ask you to write black on white, what would be the definition you would give? Maybe you will realize that, in fact, it's very difficult to give a definition of emotion. We all seem to know what an emotion is, because fortunately we have many emotions every day. Those who went to see Mona Lisa earlier already felt probably a strong emotion. But it's hard to use words to give definitions. So this is one reason why we do a lot of research, because we want to understand emotions beyond what people can say, not because people lie necessarily when they talk about their emotions, but just because it's very hard to talk about one's own emotion. And so what I would like to do, sorry, I don't know, my pointer doesn't work, is to try to elicit an emotion in you, and so we can discuss what is a current consensual definition of emotion, okay? So to elicit an emotion in you, I would like you to play with me, if you agree, and respond to the following question. Imagine the following situation. You arrive in Paris, you are at the train station, and you see a train that arrives, okay? And these trains arrive, and unfortunately, you see that there are 5 children here who will be killed by this train, okay, if the train continues on its way. But you see that the train could change its direction and go up to this direction where a worker from the SNCF is. And I would like to ask you one question. Imagine there would be one person in the world who would be able to change the direction of the train so that the 5 kids are safe, but this poor worker from the SNCF will unfortunately die because of the train, okay? And imagine this person is you, all right? Yourself. You have to take this decision now. Who among you would push this lever to change the direction of the train? There is no other option. Either you push or you do not push, okay? Please raise your hand, those of you who would push the lever to change the direction of the train, so that you save the 5 children. I know it's a strange way to start the morning, yes? Okay? And now the reason why it is interesting is because there is a second experiment. Imagine the very same situation, okay, where you have, again, the train that arrives, and this train, again, will kill the 5 children. And then, again, there is only one person in the world that can change the situation, and again, this person is you. And what you will do, you know that it will stop the train, okay? But tell me if you will do it or not. And you know that if you push this person, it will stop the train. So who among you would push the person? Okay? Did you feel something? And here, what you can see is something quite important because you realize that emotions are much more than feelings and things we experience, but they are ways to make us act, and they really drive many of our decisions, for instance, in the moral domain. And these are very famous moral dilemmas, as they are called, that are used in psychology to study the link between emotion and decision-making. Why? Because we think that the reason why you have such a big difference in the decision you make in these two situations that are equally the same in mathematical terms, okay? In both cases, you save 5 children, but you kill 1 person. The only difference probably is because of the very strong emotion that you feel here of guilt, for instance, okay, or moral disgust, or maybe other very negative emotions. And in fact, when we study this, we see that there are many regions of the brain that are differentially active when people take the decision in the second situation, when they push someone, as compared to where they push a lever. And what the results that we had here are relatively similar to the ones that are often found in research. There are about 60% of people who accept to push the lever, and only 20% of people who accept to push the person. And here you were even more cautious not to push the person. And when we use, for instance, brain imaging techniques, or if we test patients who have some lesions in the brain, we can see that one of the major differences between the two situations is the involvement of emotions. And this is something very important that we learned since maybe 15 years or 20 years. It is that the idea that maybe many of you have, that there is in the brain one system called the limbic system, that is often called the emotional brain. Just to be curious, who among you heard about the limbic system? Okay. And so the limbic system is a very important system in the brain for emotion. And people thought during a few decades that this was the key region in the brain, that is an ancestral part of our brain. But now we know that there are many, many more regions, in fact, in the brain that are important for emotions. And here I show you the network of regions that are important for emotion. And something that is very striking is that there are many cortical regions that are very important for emotion and emotion regulation. And it's not possible nowadays to say that we have in our brain an old brain, if you wish, that is the emotional part of our brain, and there are more recent parts of the brain that are our intellectual brain, okay? There are many, many, many more regions than what we thought before that are important for emotion, including at the cortical level. And there are many connections, as we will see, between these regions and other regions involved, for instance, in attention, memory, and learning in general. So this is a very important message. Let me take an example to show you how we think about emotions nowadays in psychology and neuroscience, trying to give you a dynamic view of what an emotion is and how it interacts with some cognitive mechanisms. Can you tell me what is the emotion that you feel looking at this picture here? Just give me some emotional terms. How do you feel looking at this yourself? Go ahead. How do you feel? Good, okay. Do you feel some tenderness, maybe? Yes, okay. How does this little girl feel? You think? What would you say? Okay, so it's not exactly the same emotion than the one you felt. This is a very simple example just to illustrate something that is extremely important about emotions that you are all aware of. It is the subjective nature of emotion. Emotions are subjective in the sense that there are many inter-individual differences in emotion. Two different people can have different emotions when they live exactly the same situation or similar situation. So that's why we don't think of emotions as reflexes, okay? This girl has on her retina the same visual image, or almost the same than the one you have when looking at these pictures, but of course the emotions are extremely different. And where does this subjectivity comes from? We think that the subjectivity comes mainly from the fact that we all have very different motivations. So when we have an emotion, the emotion is always elicited by a specific event. This is why we say that emotions have a specific object. So if you remember the last time you were afraid, you did not just feel fear, you were afraid of something. The last time you were sad, you were not just sad, you were sad about something. Okay? And there is a very strong relationship between the emotion that you have and the object of this emotion, something that elicits the emotion. And this is very different from a mood, for instance, that is not specifically related to a specific object that is sometimes called formal object in philosophy. And so this event can elicit an emotion, okay? But it is always done as an interaction between the emotion and your own motivations. And this is where the subjective aspect of emotion comes from. When we feel emotions of anger or disgust, there is not so much subjectivity in the sense that there are not so many differences between people in terms of the emotional response itself. The huge difference comes from the type of situations, that can elicit the emotions. And this is because we all have different values, different concerns, different interests, different goals. And this is why we have different emotions when we face a specific situation. This is why it's very important to have ways to know well the motivation of people to be able to predict the emotions that they would have in specific situations. And what we also learned in neuroscience and psychology is that emotion cannot be seen as separate from cognition, in the sense that there are very strong positive effects very often of emotion on cognition. And here I just listed the main cognitive mechanisms that are important for learning and education. And you can see that emotion has an effect on all of them. Emotion helps the way we perceive things. It facilitates visual or auditory perception. Emotion also helps us to focus our attention. It helps us to have good memories of these events that we have today and the following days. The emotions that we will feel will be very important to determine what we will remember or not. And as we just saw, it also changes the decisions we make. And so when we have an emotion, there are at least two parts that are very important to highlight. And this has two different ways to study emotions also. The first part of an emotion is what we call emotion elicitation. Emotion elicitation is a mechanism that, according to which, if you see something, or if you hear something, you will evaluate this situation, given your motivations, and this will elicit a specific situation. Okay? If you are in a museum, you see art of work, this can elicit some emotion thanks to some appraisal mechanisms. And then, once the emotion is elicited, we can study how the emotion activates different parts of the individuals. And what is typically studied in my field is to study expression, for instance, expression in the face, in the voice, in the body posture. Autonomic response, so you can record heart rate, you can record skin conductance, you can record skin temperature, for instance, to have an idea of the bodily reaction during an emotion. We also study action tendencies. So an action tendencies is this idea that when you feel an emotion, you have the tendency either to approach something, typically if it's positive, or to avoid something, typically when it is negative. And of course, when you have an emotion, you also have a conscious experience that goes with all these other things that we call feeling. And it's very important for you also to understand, I think, that when we talk about an emotion, we talk about all these components. And it's not only the feeling, or it's not only the expression, for instance. And all these components of an emotion, they are modulated by many inter-individual differences. Who already heard the term emotional intelligence in this room? Okay. And this is what we refer to when we talk about emotional competencies. For instance, your ability to recognize emotions in yourself, your ability to recognize emotions in others, or your ability to regulate your emotions. And these competencies that are part of what is often called emotional intelligence are very important to modulate these two parts of an emotion. So here you have a big picture of all the emotional process. You see how dynamic it is, and you understand why we don't talk about an emotion as a state, but we always talk about emotion as a process, with a starting point, an ending point, and some modulatory mechanisms. Let me take this opportunity to give you a formal definition of an emotion, which is the definition that we typically use in research. So emotion is defined the following way. It's event-focused, so it's focused on a specific event. There are two steps, emotion elicitation and the emotional response, and it's very fast. So only events that are relevant for you can elicit an emotion. That's why we say it is relevance-based. And it shapes multiple response: action tendency, autonomic reaction, expression, and feeling. Let me give you one example with probably an emotion that we all want to elicit in museums, which is the emotion of interest. Okay? Imagine this situation where you see there are two individuals who really seem to be interested by a work of art. And so this is the object that I referred to. And this object is perceived by these two women, and it will be appraised according to their goals, their values, their needs, their concerns, their interests. And this appraisal will cause, and this is why it's very interesting to study appraisal, because it is causal of the emotional response, changes in the other components of emotion. And in the case of interest, it will facilitate attention and memory. So in terms of appraisal, for instance, what we think will elicit interest as an emotion is the appraisal of an event as novel, so unfamiliar, sufficiently complex, but understandable. So this is a type of cognitive mechanism that will elicit a reaction in individuals. And what kind of reaction can we sometimes measure in interest? There is a rise in the autonomic nervous system, so you can measure increase in heart rate, for instance. There is a change in expression, so people tend to freeze and then to approach in a motor way the stimulus. The head and the body tends to approach. The underlying action tendency is also an approach one. Of course, you want to be closer to what is of interest to you, conceptually or physically. And there is a specific subjective experience. You can feel the emotion of interest. And what is very nice with interest, as well as with other emotions, it is that it can facilitate exploration, learning, memory. And this is why we call these emotions, this family of emotions, the epistemic emotions, or knowledge emotions. If you are interested, Paul Sylvia is the one who wrote a book on this question of interesting emotions, or emotions of interest. And the way we measure these emotions is mainly in the lab, but that would be very interesting to also do it in other places than in laboratories, but we mainly do it in the labs. And so we have a lot of techniques where we try to do the two things that I mentioned. First, we try to elicit emotions to see how people evaluate situations so that an emotion is elicited. And then we want to measure the reactions of people in all the four components of an emotion that I mentioned. It will take us too much time to go into the details, but maybe I can mention only three things that you see here. The first is fMRI. So when people are in the scanner, we can measure their brain activity according to the processing of some situation. It's not always very realistic for individuals to do this. That's why we now developed a virtual reality system where people have much more the feeling of being immersed in a situation, and it's much more realist also. We even have in this system an olfactometer, so people can also smell for it to be even more realistic. And we also use electroencephalography, which is a technique that allows to have a very good temporal resolution in emotion. And in this last part of my presentation, I would like to give you a few examples of how emotion can drive attention and memory. So first, this is a graphics of the connections. Sorry, the subtitle is in French. It's a brain connectivity between the amygdala and other regions that are important in the brain for cognition. And you see from all these connections that it's clear that the amygdala, which is a key region in emotion, doesn't live its life on its own, given the very dense connectivity that there is. For attention, can you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind when you look at this? Probably you think about things that are threatening, okay? You think about fearful events. But did you notice this, for instance? Or did you notice that these two persons exchange their faces? Okay, or did you notice a change in this color? This is just to give you the very broad idea that when we process stimulus, our attention will first be captured by things that are particularly important for us. And there is a lot of research now in neuroscience understanding what are the brain pathways of this. And we know that when there is an event that is important for someone, it will modulate activity in many regions that are important for perception and attention. And this is just to give you an idea of the types of stimuli that capture attention, because a lot of research shows that it's not only negative stimuli, but also positive stimuli that drive attention to the same extent than negative stimuli. And here are the type of stimuli that capture most attention, in fact. The faces of babies or children, erotic stimuli, money, or self-relevant stimuli, just like your first name, for instance. And I will conclude with these slides on memory. You all know that emotions can affect memory. Just raise your hands, those of you who remember what they were doing exactly on the 11th of September, when there were the attacks. Okay. And what were you doing exactly the day before? Or the day after? Probably you don't remember. Okay? And we think that this is because of the very important links that there are between the amygdala and the hippocampus. And it's just a teaser because we could spend a few hours talking about this. But coming from models of human memory, we now know that there are effects of emotion on all the mechanisms that are important for memory: encoding, consolidation, and probably even at recall stage. So when I ask you something about a past event, the fact that you have an emotion at the moment when I ask you the question can also change the way you will access memories. So all the stages of memories seems to be important. And I will conclude with maybe 3 key learnings that I wanted to convey to you this morning. The first one is about the power of the 5 components of emotion in the brain, and to show you how emotions is highly distributed, highly interconnected, and we should not think about emotion as something very specific, independent of the rest of the mind. And it's interesting to look at emotions with these 5 components and not only looking at one component in isolation. The second take-home message is the power of cognition for emotion. If you want, I can tell it this way: the more intelligent you are, the more emotionally sensitive you will be. Because the cognition that you have will be very important to elicit emotions. And the last key learning that I would like to convey is the power of education for museums that can go through emotions. And it's not because, of course, we want to educate that we should not use emotions. On the contrary, there are so strong positive effects of emotion and attention and memory that we should use and make sure we facilitate these positive emotions for attention and memory that are very important for learning. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.